researching best practices and policies in areas outside of the region or outside of Tennessee, all across the country. I'm currently mocking up kind of a presentation and format of a final product. It'll be kind of like a report, but more web-based and interactive, is kind of what we're exploring right now. I really encourage you to come to our next meeting. So we'll be really finalizing any conclusions and findings, assessing the policy alternatives and recommendations based on all of the research and input from today's panel, and reviewing the final product as a group. And we are slated on the agenda to present this research and findings to GNRC's Executive Board in October. So kind of have a timeline of tying up this effort and project that's been almost a whole year in the making by the time it's October. So now I will introduce our panelists and we will dive right in. I did forgo member introductions just for the sake of time, so we can really focus on our panelists today. So a reminder, we have Paul Corder, who's the planning director at the City of Lebanon, Joe Horne, who is director of community development at Williamson County, Bob Leeman, who is the deputy director of planning at Metro Nashville, and Kealan Millies-Lucke, who is a community and regional planner here at GNRC. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we'll have more of a discussion. So again, the panel objectives today are really to just understand what's driving land conservation at the local level, understanding the challenges and barriers to local conservation, identifying outcomes of specific policies and pinpoint those successes of why they've been successful and maybe what were some of the trade-offs. So I will introduce our panelists really quick, just so you can get a better idea of where they're coming from. And then I have a set of questions that we're just going to go to each panelist because all of their communities are very different. I have a few questions individually for the panelists, and then I'll open it up to discussion from the group if you have your own questions. So in alphabetical order, starting with Paul. Paul Corder was raised in small towns in Colorado, Missouri, and Oklahoma. He graduated from high school, ended up in Oklahoma. He has a bachelor's degree in sociology from Eastern University in St. David's, Pennsylvania, and a master's degree in geography from a School of Geography and Planning at Westchester University in Pennsylvania. And he has worked as a planner for almost 20 years. He worked with the Foothills Land Conservancy in Maryville, Tennessee. He's also worked for the Montgomery County Land Trust in Pennsylvania, and he has been a consultant for the Natural Lands Trust with the USDA. His first local planning job for a city was in Cleveland, Tennessee, where he worked for 7 years. But currently he is the planning director for City of Lebanon, where he has been for the last 9 years. Our next panelist that we'll get to know, Bob Leeman, is the Deputy Director of the Metro Nashville Planning Department and has been since 2015. He holds a bachelor's in environmental policy and a master's degree in urban planning from the University of Kansas. He has over 20 years of professional experience in land use planning. From 2009 to 2015, he managed the Land Development Division at the Planning Department before moving up into the director position. And he works regularly with community groups, elected officials, developers to help resolve the complex land use and urban design issues and streamline local planning processes for Nashville. Next one, Joe Horne is a native of Lawrenceburg, Tennessee, and began his planning career with actually Metropolitan Planning Commission for Nashville-Davidson County in 1980. After finishing grad school in 1985, he worked in the private sector for a bit. And then in 1991, he was named planning director of Williamson County and has held that post until 2002. And then now is the community development director. So in this current position, he not only oversees the planning department, but also engineering and building codes, codes compliance, sewage disposal management for Williamson County. And our other panelist, who is a staff member here at GNRC and fulfills one of our programs, which is local contract planning. Kealan originally hails from Central Michigan, and she holds a bachelor's degree in urban and regional planning with a minor in environmental sustainability from Michigan State. She moved to Middle Tennessee about 3 years ago to be a local planner for the city of Portland, where she worked for 2 years. And now at GNRC, Kealan is a community and regional planner, so she works on local planning, long-range regional plans, and special contracts for comprehensive and strategic plans. She currently serves as a contract local planner doing development and land regulation review for 7 communities: the City of Portland, Town of Coopertown, Town of Burns, Town of Ridgetop, Hartsville-Trousdale County, Dixon County, and Humphreys County. So I hope you can see the wealth of knowledge that we have with us today. And as a little icebreaker, I'm just going to ask each panelist, and again, I'll just go in last name alphabetical order. What does land conservation mean for your jurisdiction, and what are the primary motivations for conserving land in your community? So I will start with Paul Corder.
Yeah, I'm in Lebanon, obviously, and you know, we did a comprehensive plan just recently. One of the things that came out of that with our economic development team as well is that our community is very heavy into fishing and hunting and outdoor types of things, and also has a really strong agricultural feel to it. So the term, you know, conservation of land really doesn't come up very often. But when you talk in terms of agriculture and hunting and fishing, those types of things are a concern, and also beautification of the city. So that's the context that I speak in when I talk about conservation in Lebanon. I try to use those as motivating factors.
Great. I'm going to spotlight Joe now with Williamson County. So what does land conservation mean for Williamson County, and what are the primary motivations for conserving land there? Oh, you're muted.
I sound better that way. Any rate, for Williamson County, our trip down in this area began probably, I would say, in the 80s. We developed a ethos, perhaps, of what can we do to retain the rural character of Williamson County. Now, you know, obviously, it's kind of hard to go from a population of 50 some odd thousand in the 80s to what we have now, which is arguably about 250,000 people, and maintain that. Also, we also, in my office in particular, we are also dealing with the idea that we have 6 municipalities that also contribute to the development patterns of the county, and we're the 7th. And so we have always retained the idea that we would like to keep our scenic character, which, you know, to as much as we can maintain open space, you know, enhance farmland, and try to, you know, and at least even beginning in the 80s, try to stay away, if we do develop in the unincorporated, again, stay away from the sensitive lands, floodplain, steep slopes, trees, and the like. How well we've done, you know, I think it's always hard to say what could have happened if. I know that we did a couple of things at the time that have enhanced open space. As early as 1980, we had pretty well banned the development of property in the floodplain, which made a big difference, particularly given the onslaught we got shortly thereafter of what could have happened in Williamson County. It's a lot easier to, I guess, stop something from happening when it's not moving than to stop something from happening once it started to move. But even to our most recent efforts, including the 2012 comprehensive plan, and ultimately the 2020 update, where we developed a pretty exacting large lot or larger lots. Over roughly half the county now is zoned 1 unit to 5 acres, inclusive of the cities. So we have at least a pretty good template in the future to maintain this open rural character. What we do with it is unknown at this time, though.
Great, thank you. That's a really good kind of scope as how Williamson County has grown. Next, I'll turn it to Bob. What does land conservation mean within Nashville-Davidson County, and what are the primary motivations for conserving land here?
But we're always evolving. I mean, we have a huge amount of growth and development at all times, and I would say over the last 15 years, we've kind of made our land use policies a little more nuanced than they were 20 years ago. I think we had more just cut and dry land use policies that were density based, that if you were in a certain area, it was 2 to 4 units per acre or 4 to 9 units per acre. And I think we started looking at the transect and developing a transect from urban to rural areas to try to better define each part of the city and to try to set up land use policies to better conserve different rural areas. I think we're unique in that we have all types of areas in Davidson County. We go from downtown to midtown to suburban to rural and areas in Jolton with large amounts of hills. And I think we're constantly evolving our policies and our regulations to better address the type of development we're seeing. I mean, what we thought was undevelopable 15, 20 years ago is now being developed. I mean, land values have gone up, and areas that at one time they weren't considering to develop, we're now seeing development on those. And so we just recently have had to update our subdivision regulations and our zoning code to better address what formerly were cluster lot subdivisions. We changed the name of those to conservation subdivisions. And so, I mean, a lot of it's based on just what's happening. That's how we've evolved and what's important to us and what we're seeing on the ground, and so we get phone calls and we have development applications where people are really concerned that the hills in Nashville are not being preserved like they once were. And I think just that forces us to look at our policies and our regulations to see where updates are needed. So I think we're continually doing that.
It's great to hear. All right, Kealan, I know in your case, since you manage 7 communities, you can either give an example of one or a couple or just a trend across all 7 if it rings true. But what does land conservation mean for one of your or all of your communities? And what are the primary motivations for conserving land in these smaller communities?
Yeah, so I think, you know, the unique part about the communities that I serve is that they're all fairly small rural communities that are just beginning to feel the pressures of growth. And so, you know, conservation hasn't been much of a concern in the past, but it's now, as they're experiencing, you know, growth pressures, it's starting to be a concern. And so we're beginning to, you know, start to implement regulations and things to conserve land and to address some of these problems. But I think the thing across all of the communities that I try to bring for, you know, what the value of land conservation is we're really trying to balance the short-term benefits of growth and development with the long-term benefits of preserving some of the things that some of these communities care very much about. And it does differ between the different communities what their priorities are necessarily, but across the board, some of the big themes that we see, preserving rural character is something that comes up in all of my communities. Several of the communities mitigating the hazards of natural disasters. Several of them have particular risks in their communities, and so those are big issues and big concerns. Also, because they are fairly agricultural rural areas, preserving and ensuring the feasibility of agriculture, that the land values don't go up so high that it makes agricultural uses, you know, kind of impossible to continue. And then preserving environmental quality. So a lot of, worried about groundwater, worried about septic systems. A lot of these places don't have sewer, so soils areas and perking and those sorts of things are very important. So I think those are kind of the big themes, but it does definitely vary across different communities, and it's interesting to see how they're evolving.
I love hearing all about policies evolving across all of our panelists. So that's always good to hear when you're like, are they doing anything about this? So we did touch on some of my other kind of sub questions, so I'll just kind of shuffle. But as a general question to each of you, what areas do you feel your community has been very successful in conserving land? And this can be like in the space of trees or steep slopes or those floodplain regulations, like a very specific resource, or across the board large swaths of land, just kind of whatever scale that you feel you've been most successful in. So alphabet, Paul, do you want to go first?
Sure, yeah. Floodplains are a big issue in Lebanon, and I think we've done a pretty good job of working with the floodplains and trying to alleviate the flooding that happens. Wetlands, and this kind of gets into the unintended consequences. I think wetlands have been preserved pretty well in some areas, and maybe too much actually, in the sense that it's almost impossible to get road connections when somebody develops a piece of farmland, and it turns out that part of that farmland is considered wetlands. Then you can't get a road across to make connections, to make proximity, and keep people in closer proximity to each other and to businesses. But on the flip side, you get a large development and they can take the top off a mountain and move a stream. So, there's some really good successes in how we preserve certain places. And then you have a lot of big losses and trees coming down. So those would be where we're not doing so well in Lebanon. But they're tied together, and some of the scales don't always match the consequences.
It's definitely a complex answer for a complex issue. Joe, I'll turn it to you. What areas do you feel Williamson County is really taking strides and being successful in this conservation topic?
Well, one thing I think has happened, and it's an ongoing project we have right now, is the fact that we're in the process of renewing our dreaded 1101 template. And one of the things that did happen with the 2020 change in zoning for a good portion of the county was, I think it has sort of pushed development back to areas where development perhaps is more suited, which would be the several cities within Williamson County. I think that was a pretty strong step in the right direction. The interesting thing is, because of, from a pure analytical standpoint, we're less than 2 years into this, and so we really haven't been able to see how successful that will turn out to be. The other part that we've dealt with as far as success is, I will say this for everybody. I think we've made every mistake that we could have made somewhere over time, and mistakes are good things to exploit when you've got a some really poor examples. Our early delvings into conservation subdivisions date back to the 70s, and each of them now, we preserve we're preserving the floodplain in a couple of these subdivisions, and dagnabbit, both subdivisions flooded in 2010 and since then. So we've had to sharpen our tools, and we've had to take advantage of the fact that there is a pretty strong slow growth contingency in Williamson County that doesn't want to see every farm eaten alive by development. And again, it's you have to be flexible, and again, you have to be willing to. What is the old cliche? Never let a good crisis go to waste. And I think that we've been fairly successful exploiting examples of where we did not do so well. So as far as that goes, I'm looking forward to the next couple of years to see with some of these changes we were able to implement in 2020, see how that will work again, working with our partners in the cities, because I think that from a land preservation standpoint and from the idea of what kind of population growth we're looking at, I think the better model is that primarily that we need to be focusing growth toward the cities where the infrastructure is in place, rather than having to go out and deal with the economic tax-driven issues of emergency services, upgrading rural roads, and things like that.
I really appreciate your example and analogy of sharpening tools. I am a big learner from mistakes, so I appreciate that. Bob, I'll turn it to you. What do you think have been the best successes or examples of success for conservation in Nashville?
Well, I think kind of following up what Joe was talking about, we started in probably around 2004, 2005, just updating our zoning code and our land use policies to allow more infill development. And I think we have better utilized existing infrastructure. And I think it's kind of beyond our wildest dreams in 2005, so the amount of growth we've seen in certain parts of the city. I mean, and like Joe, some of it's good, some of it's maybe not so good, depending on your perspective. But I mean, we have a unique phenomenon in Nashville, the detached duplex, which the tall skinnies that some people like, some people don't like so well, but they are infill. I mean, we've seen a lot of areas where single family homes are torn down and two detached homes go up. And I mean, I think those, at the scale we're seeing it, it's not what we really anticipated when we changed that code in 2010 to allow detached duplexes, because I don't think we ever imagined it on this scale. But I think it does have a benefit of having a little bit more density in certain areas on existing infrastructure. And we've Nashville Next, some of the primary principles of Nashville Next were to develop the corridors and to develop more density in centers, so as to sort of preserve those more rural areas. We're still seeing pressures in rural areas, but I think without some of the policies we put in place to allow some of that infill, we'd probably be seeing it at an even greater scale. So I would say that's one of our successes, of just being able to continually evolve those policies to allow more infill.
I really like that example because it shows that relationship of, like, there's areas where you should conserve land and areas where you shouldn't. And so infill in a really dense area makes a lot of sense. Kealan, what do you feel is a success in one or a couple of your communities that have been taking strides in conservation?
Yeah, so I think it's kind of interesting hearing from everyone, especially Paul, because in my experience, I've found that sort of the first domino that seems to go in preserving land and cities and counties getting involved in ensuring, conservation of land for the future really is that flood protection. So FEMA, has a really excellent ordinance, that they mandate all of the cities that are part of that insurance program. All of them have to adopt, and I have found that the communities are actually quite good at enforcing that and understand and value the reason for protecting flood-prone areas. So that does seem to be sort of the first domino to go, and then it's interesting to hear from Bob, because some of my larger communities, which are nothing like Lebanon or Metro, but as they're getting older, and a little bit larger, we're seeing that increasing density in areas that are already, urbanized are definitely the next sort of step. But it does seem to be that first domino to fall is protecting those floodplains.
Yeah, I'm not surprised by that, especially since one of your communities is Humphreys, and so they just had their own kind of 2010 flood in Waverly really recently. So it's probably at the front of everyone's mind, just like tornado preparedness might be.
Exactly.
I'm going to pivot to kind of shift from local policies and more talk about the state level. Local policy is only enabled within those limitations of state level, whether it's what planning powers they're given or state environmental definitions. We do have a lot of state agencies on the call and represented here, so keep that in mind with your answer, that they're paying attention. So I would ask, what state level regulations or policies, definitions create barriers to local land conservation, either in practice or in policy? Paul, go to you.
Yeah, and I think a great theme that's coming out of this from everybody is really trying to push development back into the cities. And one of the things that we're seeing is there's just a mentality that bigger is better. And one of the obstacles that we're seeing right now is there's regulations that about infrastructure with the separation of sewer lines and water lines. And the water departments are trying to meet the state regulations of separation. And the consequence that we're seeing from that particular rule is instead of, having areas that can be in close proximity, can be smaller, fit more units in, we're seeing right-of-ways, they're 50 feet wide and you have 20, 30 feet of easements on the outside of it just to fit all the utilities in. And that just pushes development out. For one property, it's not that big of a deal. But when you do it through the whole city, through the whole county, you start to see that it's pushing everything further and further away. And in our community, what it means is you really can't have street trees. So this policy or this rule about separation of utilities is being used as the reason why street trees can't be put next to roads. We're in the South, it's hot. If you can't have street trees next to sidewalks, it's going to be very difficult in the summertime for people to be able to walk. So thinking about policies that really push the development into the cities and keep the rural areas rural, I think is important. And the concept of bigger is not always better. We really need to think about how we're going to have our policies work. And that's just one that comes to mind because it's active right now. And it's one that I wouldn't have even thought of. Like, it just is a random policy that's really having a whole lot of impact on how local development happens. And it's just the placement of utilities in the road, in the right of way, in the easements.
That's interesting, because I've heard that same kind of issue from Tom with the unincorporated Wilson County, which doesn't even have that many utilities, but he also sees it as a barrier. So it's interesting, especially because Wilson, I know, has a lot of limestone, so it's hard to even put the utilities in. Joe, we'll turn it to you. If there's any state level regulations or policies that create barriers for you at the local level.
Oddly enough, it can be, what's the definition of agriculture in this state can make it rather entertaining. We have, I used to think I knew what agriculture was, and I'm not sure if I do anymore, because there are a lot of, the exemptions for things like retreats, wedding chapels, and alike. make it difficult. You feel like you don't necessarily have what I would call a level playing field, because some of it is about how pervasive you can make your argument that you're agriculture. But as far as the other part to this, and I will say this, even now, very quietly, even with some of the things we have been successful with, we've had to be mindful of what might happen at the General Assembly. The General Assembly this past session introduced a law that would have been essentially gave a property owner the right, it felt like his property had been devalued over the prior 3 years, to go back and not make a takings claim perhaps, but make a statement that his property has been devalued and the county would owe him the right of the difference between what he would have made under the prior zoning, the value under the prior zoning and the current zoning. And that was a pretty interesting thing to kind of keep track of. Ultimately, it went away, but there are times, I'll say this, I hope nobody from the General Assembly's up there. They tend to want to get involved in local politics or local planning decisions, and it makes it difficult from our level to implement what we're hearing from our community. I can assure you, we did not make some of the changes we made in 2020 without a lot of impetus from local communities. Even the dreaded, 1 unit to 5 acre passed 23-1 in a 24-member county commission. So there was widespread support of that.
That's a really interesting one. I kind of anticipated that answer, because agricultural is definitely a wide definition in Tennessee compared to other states. That's something that we've learned through the research of this effort. Bob, I will turn it to you. Are there any state level regulations or policies that create some challenges for Metro Nashville and local land conservation?
Honestly, I'm not really thinking of anything immediately that comes into play all the time in Nashville. I think the main thing that we're always cognizant of is when we rewrite regulations and try to update those based on what council members or constituents, what we're hearing from them. We're always cognizant of the possibility of preemption. So we try to work with all sides when we adopt new regulations and vet those as thoroughly as possible to try to find if there's any issues that are out there, so that we're not preempted by the state. But I think we do the best we can to try to address that and meet with the development community, and I think we've been pretty successful in the recent past doing that.
That's great. It might be honestly just a proximity thing, being the capital city. Have a better channel for collaboration than having to drive in. Kealan, are there any issues that have come from the state regulations or policies in any of your communities that you've found challenging as the regulation reviewer?
Yeah, the one that this question kind of made me think of that I bumped into in all of my communities is sort of the 5 acre rule, which isn't really, a rule per se, but it's sort of this idea that you can't consider anything above 5 acres that doesn't require public improvement or infrastructure to be a lot. And so it gives the local planning commission a lot less control over the sort of remainder of these big tracts as they're broken up. And quite often what we're seeing now, sort of in light of that, balancing the short-term effects and the short-term growth pressure with the long-term, considerations, is that developers currently, or property owners, are carving off the little bit of road frontage and leaving these big flag lots that are above 5 acres that the city, currently as it stands, doesn't seem like a big deal. It meets those regulations. It's not, it's got one house on it in the back, but as we find as these cities are growing out and sprawling out that as we want to come and start building infill, that these lots that have been sort of sliced off are harder to, there's a lot of sort of dead infrastructure before you're making any money on the lots, and that's really unappealing to developers. So the infill is then more challenging. So that's definitely one sort of at the beginning of these communities experiencing growth pressure with lots of available land. That's one that we're seeing where the developers aren't quite thinking, far ahead in terms of infill, and the cities and counties just don't quite have much of a leg to stand on in terms of enforcing what those sort of remaining tracts are like.
I think that gets into like a buy-in issue. It's probably hard to convince a commission like, no, you need a sidewalk here when there's nothing out there yet. But those long-term effects of subdividing land are very true. I'm sure there's flag lots across the region.
And it's not effects that you will see for the next 20, 30, 40 years, but eventually down the road.
We've talked a little bit about unintended consequences or kind of some trade-offs, but I would like to know one big concern that people have with conservation a lot of the time is it's slowing the development community or, pushing it elsewhere or kind of affecting property values. I know that was a big thing that was brought up in the Williamson County lot change was how is this going to affect my property value? So I'd like to ask about any impacts specifically that have slowed development or actually outcome in some of those concerns that people bring up when you talk about conservation. So if property values are actually going down or if, the incentives aren't enough or if development has slowed where you didn't expect it to. Paul, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, I think the one of the unintended consequences that I see is the rules on annexation. We talked a little bit about. You asked a little bit about annexation, and I think it's a positive unintended consequence, maybe, or maybe it is the intended consequence, which is limiting the city's ability to just go out and grab land. I think for our community specifically, we've got a very large city limits for the population, and just recently the changes in laws for annexation have really helped with that, and so that's bringing that down and really moving things closer. Having large lots in the rural areas and then limiting the annexations that are possible without the property owner's consent and moving it back in has been a very helpful thing that the state has done. And that just the last thing that was mentioned about the roads and the connections, huge unintended consequences. I sometimes refer to my office as the office of unintended consequences, but making the road connections is one of the hardest things to do, and not leaving those interior lots empty. The road connections, the neighbors don't want them, the developer doesn't want to build them, the city council doesn't want to fight that fight, and yet it's essential for having value in the land that's left over in the middle of the large blocks. So that's a huge part of it. For us, we had a little bit of an unintended consequence. Fortunately, our regulations aren't very good, but conservation developments, they haven't been as attractive as some communities because there's not a whole lot of incentive, but you tend to get higher density close to fragile or land that's worth preserving when you do conservation developments or cluster subdivisions for that matter. You basically preserve the open space and cluster the buildings a little bit closer together. So that's a little bit of an unintended consequence that we've seen is, and I worry about some how to fix that is putting, you've identified a fragile area, an area that could flood, floodplains, and then you put a lot of houses right next to it, but not in it. And then if your map's wrong, you've got that unintended consequence.
Yeah, flooding's a hard one because all of those new rooftops are just going to make it flood that much more too. I appreciate all those examples. Joe, I don't know if you have any kind of unintended consequences or if areas of the county have slowed due to the conservation policies, and if they are going back to the cities like you wanted, or if there's parts that you wanted a town center and now it's not happening.
Well, we've tried to anticipate a few of those. First of all, as one might guess, November 2020, when we did make the change, we were inundated by many projects, usually conservation in nature, and that didn't go over very well with the communities the community that was excited about the potential downzoning. I always found it kind of interesting because they would say, well, they're just bringing it in so they can beat the zoning change. And I'm going, yeah, that makes sense to me. So to that extent, that was one of the things that did happen. What we are finding though is we do have certain areas, we call them one of the planned growth areas in the county, where we did have some, we're seeing some activity, people interested in doing the development and develop there that is improved, that we think is going to help somewhat. And we have what we call villages and hamlets where we're hoping for that too. Williamson County underwent a sea change though that really made our jobs a lot more difficult with the introduction of small flow sewer plants to this area back in 2004. And suddenly, we used to have a cliche I've overused, which was, development's kind of based on an idea that the table can't wobble. All that means is you got to match your resources, your water, your sewer, and your road capacity. And when, sewer was always kind of our default mechanism because public sewer was generally unavailable. With the introduction of these small flow plants, we ended up seeing a lot of development showing up in areas where we didn't entirely anticipate it, because that was back under a 1 dwelling unit per acre template. The other thing we discovered too, and this is you said unintended results. I don't know if it was an unintended result. It never made sense to me. In 2012, when we were going through this, one of the things we did was we said, hey, we used to have for conservation subdivisions, we have a 14,000 square foot lot minimum. And, so that's about a third of an acre lot, and anywhere ranging from, 50% open space in there. Why don't we open up more land to be preserved by making it 10,000 square feet? We did that, and I swear, I think the designs got worse. I don't know why, but we ended up with a lot of things that happened where we would suddenly be pushing development away from resource areas. But while pushing in the resource areas, it pushed it closer to the existing infrastructure, roads mostly. And then suddenly we were dealing with the fact that we were preserving land that nobody could see. And we made some adjustments, buffers, distances and everything else. And quality went up a bit, I would say. But, the problem with quality of development, quality of open space, it's not, it's pretty qualitative. So.
I really am loving the specificity that you all are giving. This panel is really fun for me. I'll turn it over to Bob. Do you have any examples of kind of unintended consequences, had to go back to the drawing board in Nashville when it came to a policy?
Well, we haven't seen a lot of slowdown in any areas, but I mean, I would say the thing that comes to mind is during Nashville Next in 2015, when we adopted the updated general plan. There was a part of the city, the Whites Creek part of the city, where a lot of the community came out and wanted to see that maintained as a more rural area. And there was a big debate over what policy should be applied to that area. And actually, it got, even though Nashville Next was adopted in 2015, I think it was like 13 properties in the Whites Creek area were kept out of that update for a year so that we could go back and sort of study that area and continue to work with the community. And I think the vision from a lot of the people in that area was that it would be a rural area, but the city extended sewer lines 30, 40 years ago, and a large number of properties were already zoned for suburban development. They were zoned RS10. They weren't agricultural or large lot. And so overall, except for some of those 13 properties that were held out, most of it was made into a rural conservation policy area, even though they had properties zoned for 10,000 square foot lots. And if you do a cluster lot subdivision, you could cluster down to 5,000 square foot lots. And so that set up sort of a unintended consequence. Even though we were setting a vision at that time, we felt like we would still review any applications that came in for subdivisions under the subdivision regulations, and they might be able to still move forward if they were zoned and met the subdivision regulations. But during over the past few years, there's been multiple lawsuits, and I think we've had one lawsuit where the judge said, no, you need to look at Nashville Next. There's one line in our subdivision regulations that refers to the general plan, and they said because that's there, you now have to look at the general plan as well as the subdivision regulations to some extent. And that's caused a lot of changes and confusion over how we review and subdivision plats, and I mean, we're still kind of in the middle of that in trying to see what direction to go. But we've had lots of debates over development in rural policy areas on properties that were zoned RS10 50 years ago, and where sewer lines exist. They're not on septic or anything like that would kind of dictate it be more rural or larger lot. So I think that policy decision was even though the majority of the community pushed for it, it's caused a lot of unintended consequences over the years.
That is a fascinating example. I mean, the Whites Creek area does appear to be pretty rural, but it's kind of interesting how the community maybe didn't connect the comprehensive plan and the zoning to what they really wanted. That's fascinating. Kealan, I'll turn it to you. If there's been any unintended consequences, I know your communities are slower to grow, and so maybe they haven't seen them yet. But if there's any examples, I'd love to know.
Yeah, so like you said, a lot of my communities, are just starting to enforce some of these, so we really haven't had time to experience unintended consequences. I'm sure they're coming. But this question kind of made me think that it's less of a policy and more of a conservation misconception that we seem to bump into in a lot of these communities. And that is that if you want the community to stay rural, you should just make a minimum 1 acre lot size everywhere and end it at that. And we actually, when I worked in Portland in particular, we did quite a bit of analysis and found that the 1 acre lots that have one single family residential use on it, they don't pay for the utilities and the infrastructure that are in front of that lot. So the property taxes that the city is gaining doesn't actually pay for the maintenance then of that infrastructure. And so what it kind of does is it creates almost like a pyramid scheme of growth where to pay for existing 1 acre lots and the infrastructure needed to service those lots, the city is almost in a bind to agree and allow more sprawling 1 acre lots just further and further and further out. And it's incentivizing sprawl really because they need that tax revenue and that property tax to pay for the already existing infrastructure. And, you know, then these 1 acre lots are very difficult to infill later. So that's one thing that I think people didn't really understand. And we ended up finding in Portland that the 15,000 square feet is where the city finally breaks even on just being able to afford to maintain the infrastructure for those lots. But that's definitely something I've come across, especially out in counties, which, you know, there are different considerations when you're not extending water and sewer lines, just roads. But the 1 acre lot rule character is a very short-termed idea that I think just is easy for people to get stuck in their heads, and it's not easy to see what those long-term effects could possibly be.
That's a good one. That's very like strong towns answer. They always talk about infrastructure paying for itself. And I know like in community meetings, I hear that a lot too, like of people like, I want to be rural, 1 acre lots. And I'm like, an acre's not even that big. Like, do you realize that you're not really getting that much out of having a bunch of 1 acre neighbors? So that's a good example of, especially of how it's kind of a catch-22. It keeps doing the sprawl. I'm gonna do a couple more questions for each individual panelist based on more specific questions, and then I'll open it up to, so Kealan, I'll just start with you. In the communities that have limited conservation policies and maybe don't have any standards to protect them, what do you think would create impetus to implement some of those, or what would make it more feasible for them to start exploring those?
So I have kind of a strong opinion on this one. The biggest thing that I have found in all of these communities across the board is the biggest sort of block to commissions sort of standing their ground and fighting for conservation and policies that have sort of proven long-term positive effects, but maybe are a little bit less palatable on the short term, you know, or palatable to developers. But the biggest block to that is definitely cities and counties that don't have comprehensive plans. So without any sort of adopted unified vision, it's very difficult for planning commissions to feel like they have sort of a leg to stand on. In turn, you know, they have ideas and there are policies about, we would like to preserve areas like this. We would like to not encourage, you know, sprawling suburban growth everywhere, but they don't have these areas clearly defined. And so they don't feel that they actually have the ability or the backing of, you know, an adopted document to be able to actually stand their ground and tell developers no in some areas and encourage, you know, more density in other areas. So I think that's definitely sort of like the biggest thing that a comprehensive plan gives these communities, sort of that ability to begin looking towards the future and have something to, you know, right back to the short-term, you know, consequences or the short-term effects and the long-term effects. The comprehensive plans is definitely the thing that gives them the ability to sort of look into the future and make decisions today that are positive for the future.
That's a, you know, really relevant example, considering our other panelists have brought up their own communities' comprehensive plans and how they were the guiding vision with the public, or the, you know, actually came into the law like sphere and courtroom. So that's definitely a gap for a smaller community if they don't understand what their constituents want. Bob, I'm going to ask you a question. What stipulations or negotiations kind of take place to further those comprehensive plan priorities with developers in more of those flexible development zones? So what is the back and forth in like the SP or planned unit development zone with those developers?
Yeah, we see quite a few specific plan rezonings every year, and I think it's one of our primary tools that we have to try to conserve land. I think We look at each rezoning on a case-by-case basis and look at the site to determine, does it have floodplain? Does it have tree masses? Does it have steep slopes? And we work with the development community to try to design around those elements on the site as much as possible. And I mean, we have to look at each one, given its location, either on an arterial or not on an arterial, or what the character is surrounding it, to determine the best ways to conserve or preserve tree masses. But I think we do that every day, work with the development community to try to find a middle ground where the most amounts of the conservation areas can be preserved. I mean, we have some really aggressive plans that are proposed, and I think at the outset, I think a lot of times they look different at the time they get to the planning commission versus when we're having pre-application meetings. And so it's not entirely on us. I mean, they go through a process where they have community meetings, and the community will also have input and say that, you know, that's too much, or it needs to preserve whatever's important to that community. And so I think we have that opportunity to put conditions on SPs and to work with developers to redesign around those elements. And so we do that every day.
I really appreciate getting to know that process a little better, because it is such a case-by-case flexible standard. I'm going to turn it to Joe. You've talked a lot about the lot sizes and then how that's maybe pivoted to the conservation subdivisions. But I wanted to know, in the case of conservation subdivisions or other voluntary policies, how often are they really utilized? Or are there any things that you think could be done to incentivize them to be more utilized?
Well, I'll say this, we have, we try to take, we are the recipients of people of different policies, not necessarily our own. I know Emily Paris is on here, and I know Land Trust has got roughly 7,500 acres under conservation easements in Williamson County, at least the last word I got a few weeks ago. And we still use the state's Greenbelt policy to a certain extent as well. I mean, in the sense that as of yesterday, we had about 214,000 acres that are under Greenbelt. Now, that's a holding zone, I guess, because of rollback and all the different ways one can convert that after the payment of rollback taxes. One thing I will say, and it's a discussion that we've sort of whispered about too, where we sit right now is not going to be where Williamson County will be in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years from now. Because as this county develops, I think that we're going to see some of these 5-acre districts probably go away based on that. We'll also see some of these 5-acre districts perhaps be swallowed up by the communities they're adjacent to. And none of that's bad. I tell people many times, I work in Oz. We get to do a lot of things that other communities dream about doing, in the sense that we do have a strong open space ethic. We do have a strong natural resource ethic. You know, the important thing I tell my staff, and I tell myself too, we need to avoid screwing it up wherever we can. So.
Thank you for that answer. Paul, I'll ask you the last specific question, and then roundtable members, I'll open it up to you to ask your own questions. So Paul, I know that the planning department has struggled to draft a tree ordinance and get it adopted. So what struggles have you faced with getting those drafts adopted? And what do you think it would take to get one adopted and implemented in Lebanon?
Yeah, we've had a tree ordinance. You know, a lot of communities have urban foresters, that type of thing. Having a dedicated person to administer it isn't not having that as an obstacle to getting that through. But we've written one that can be done without having an urban forester, one that's fairly simplified. And there's an odd take on it. I don't think the public really pushes back on it, but you do get this, I've mentioned the street trees and the struggles to get those, and just some bizarre arguments for not having trees, like, you're going to leave an ice spot on the road in the winter if you have a tree close to the road. Trees get into everything. They get into the utilities, those types of things. But you see that from the maintenance and the how you have to maintain the community, and trying to get past the idea that you can't just put utilities in the ground, you can't put services in the ground and roads in and sidewalks in and expect them to last for 60 years without any maintenance. And I think a community really can, the people in the community can really tell when the mentality is we're just not going to maintain things, we're just going to build it in a way that they don't have to be maintained. Because particularly in Lebanon, there's this stark feeling when you come out of the Smokies, you come over the Cumberland Plateau with all the lush green trees, and you come into Lebanon, which is, cedar glades, which are barren. That's one of the aspects of a cedar glade is it's fairly barren feeling. So the contrast is big. So the need for trees, I think the public sees it very well. We're in the South. We need shade. There's copy and paste things in our ordinances that say we need to make sure that we have enough light and we have enough air. Well, those were written in the North. Having too much light is not, or having not enough light is not a problem in the South. We need to start looking at New Orleans or Savannah or Charleston and how they developed for the South. And we've got the mentality of just copying and pasting ordinances that don't really apply. So for the tree ordinance, I mean, it's just little things, having a little confusion about what properties this will apply to. Like, will it be 5 acres? Will it be 2 acres? Will it be half an acre? Little things like that just derail it when you have all this other momentum of questions and concerns about, how easy is it going to be to maintain, keeping the trees and the debris that comes off of it. So it's been difficult for little things, but those little things add up to enough concern that it's hard to get that through. Now, I think the mayor's been a very big advocate of doing this, and unfortunately, he doesn't have a vote when it comes through the planning commission, when it comes through city council. So we're still working on it. I think it'll happen before too long. Similar situation with open space regulations, how to really do those things. But that's where we are with the tree ordinance right now.
As a undergraduate forestry major, I really appreciate that answer. There's definitely a lot of confusion around trees for whatever reason. All right, so roundtable, I'm going to give you the floor. I encourage you to use the raise hand function so you can ask your questions, or you can ask them through the chat. I'm also putting up their contact information if you want to contact any panelist specifically about an example you heard about, or just ask them questions or tell them they did a great job. Don't all jump at once. Any raise hands? Any pressing questions for our panelists?
I have a question for, if I can ask a question, if nobody else has anything, I have one, but I'll let others go first.
It looks like we have one from Dory at Harpeth Conservancy.
Hey, I mean, Joe and Horne and I have known each other for a very long time, and Joe brought up some really, really interesting, like long-term dynamics that that are very relevant. And then it was interesting listening to all the panelists, because I think one of the challenges that I've seen in working on growth and development issues for 20 years is it's not a cut and paste kind of approach, just like others have been saying. So infill in an urban area like Nashville is going to be different than infill in a county, or how do you want to have a city and a county look? And one of the things that's been fascinating too is that you may want a sidewalk inside your new development, but as Joe was pointing out, maybe you don't want to see the development from the rural road that has a huge value from the cyclist perspective. So it's been really interesting to be a part of some of these discussions, because it's not a one size fits all. And when you think about how to do this type of rural open space conservation, the other thing that's going on now is it's not just we want it to look like an urban area, but really how do we maintain rural industry? So food production, let's say it's horse stables or whatever that is. And so zoning doesn't get at all of that. And even the city of Franklin, which is very urban, is considering that they now need to review their land use plan in terms of how can they maintain some more rural look and rural industry in parts of the city. So it's a moving target. And that one point about flag lots and 1 acres, you're absolutely right. 1 acre lots across the county does not protect rural land at all. I would love to be a part of any kind of efforts to sort of help with like making sure we all learn from each other so we don't keep repeating the same mistakes. But we're a bigger region now. And so some of the folks in the outlying counties actually might want to view themselves in terms of what they can provide to as part of a 20 or 10 county region. You don't want it, the same type of growth pattern isn't the same in each county, because they have different histories and they have different geographies as well. Anyway, I just wanted to throw in that comment, because whatever Nashville might be doing in one situation may not be the approach that would make sense in Lebanon, and vice versa. And I know we all know that, but I'm not sure a lot of folks really kind of get that.
Great. It looks like we have a question from Emily Parrish in the chat. She's looking to hear about what other cities you may look to as models and who's doing it well. Any panelist that feels they can answer this, feel free.
This is Paul. It's a question that I've actually thought about a lot. I know Franklin has model cities that they look to, but you know, looking at communities that have done it well is challenging, because there's you don't want to go too far out of Tennessee, and Tennessee and the South have some good examples, but they do tend to rank poorly in a lot of ways. So being able to expand that outside of Tennessee and the South is important, including the Midwest. I think that's a good place to look, where places are doing well. And then also internationally, there's actually a lot of really good things going on in Memphis right now, because they have to do it. So we're growing, we're prospering right now, but looking at areas where they have to do other things to survive is where we need to be thinking about how to get the best practices out of things. So, you know, you've got some examples of that. But then again, I'll come back to, you do want to stay in the South, like Savannah's and Charleston's and New Orleans, because some of the things don't translate in other places to the circumstances in the South. So I'm a local planner. I feel like in the South, and I think the South is great. I think that we need to step it up a little bit as far as our, you know, what we do. You know, I hear a lot about what a small town is, everybody wants a small town feel, not Nashville, but in the surrounding areas, and really having an example of what the small town feel actually is, as opposed to the 1 acre lots. You know, I did a survey once, and one of the comments came back is my ideal housing situation would be a 20 acre lot in a subdivision. And, you know, we get the 5 acres. We want 5 acres. We want to be within 5 minutes of work. We want to be 5 minutes within, you know, church and schools and shops. And some of that stuff's not possible, but everybody thinks that that's a small town. And it really helps to go actually look at small towns and what people are asking for. I think, you know, Nashville's done a good job. Murfreesboro, there's parts of that. There's, you know, even Carthage, there's examples of what we want to see, and it's a strong downtown. It's actually mixing the uses, mixing the housing and the commercial, and having jobs within close proximity. So there's a lot of good examples out there. What I always try to go back to is what has worked in all times and in all places. And if it's worked in all times and in all places, so even beyond our time, then you can probably trust it to be true. If it's a new idea that's never been tried before, you might be a little skeptical.
I really appreciate that answer too, as I'm looking at peer regions and best practices. And there's definitely some new ideas out there that sound a little far-fetched sometimes. We've got another raised hand from Greg Wadden. Go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you, Carson. Great discussion this morning. It seems to me, I'm thinking more about Nashville-Davidson County than the surrounding counties, but I think this applies to all of them. It seems to me that the developers really have the upper hand on these things. They understand the systems, the processes, what they have to do. And at least in the area where I live, we're seeing a lot of loss of tree canopy, subdivisions coming in that make no sense, that kind of thing. And the question I have for the group is really, what can citizens do to better prepare themselves for these unwise developments that are coming in? And what can we do to prepare for those kinds of things and understand the process, the system, get ahead of the curve as opposed to reacting to developments that are coming in and having to respond to them after a lot of stuff has already happened. So.
Well, I'll speak from Nashville's standpoint. I mean, it's getting involved with the community planning process early on, and when we do update the general plan or a community plan, to sort of be involved with that. And I mean, we're frequently updating our zoning code and subdivision regulations, maybe not frequently, but on a fairly regular basis, and sort of staying involved with that and watching our agendas to see when those text amendments come up, and I think just being as involved as you can early on helps from our standpoint.
I would add too to what Bob said. By the time a project is sitting before a planning board, you are looking at what the regulations, subdivision, zoning, and what have you will give you. I guess this sort of circles back around to my cryptic statement I made earlier. A lot of times it will take things that didn't turn out the way we thought. I used to tell people that I think zoning ordinances work out about 70% of the time to do what you think they're going to do, and then you get to deal with the 30% you wish. I'd love to have a give back on that. But to what Bob said is true. You have to care enough to keep track of things, and much as I hate to be the beneficiary at times, also have people point out the inconsistencies and why didn't you do this, and maybe we can do things better, because it's a collaborative process, it's a balancing act, and we like to think we get it right most of the time and most of the ways, but I can't say we always got it right.
I do have a question that was emailed from Kendra Abkowitz, who's with the Mayor's Office of Sustainability. And she's got kind of a regional scope question. How has Nashville's land use policies and growth maybe affected the surrounding communities and their policies as we've been growing as a region? Kind of a hard one to answer, but
This is Paul. One thing that just popped to my head when on that question was really specific to Wilson County and some of the land use policies. And there's actually a contrast that we're going through the county growth plan right now. It's opened up, so we're looking at it, and there's a huge contrast between Mount Juliet and Lebanon in that there's this, and I think it's unique to Wilson County, but there's a wastewater authority for the whole county, and Lebanon has a deal with the wastewater authority that they stay out of our urban growth boundary. What I've learned recently is that Mount Juliet does not, and so step systems and that type of growth is happening in the western part of Wilson County, you know, in a way that I hadn't really been aware of because it really didn't play into my world. But I think Joe mentioned, you know, some of these alternative sewer systems and how that growth is happening throughout the region really does. Sewer just is so important to how you develop and how you, because if sewer goes into a place, all your other resources may not be there, and then you have to scramble with fire and police and all the other services that go into it, schools, you know, that type of thing. And getting a grasp on that, the sewers, the alternative sewer systems seems to be a big issue. And like I said, we've got to set up so that we're in pretty good shape, but just learning about it in Wilson County is, I think it affects the whole region, and would be interesting to see how many other areas have that issue.
yeah, we did some community meetings for the unincorporated counties land use plan update. And I think the most interesting thing I heard in Mount Juliet specifically was they don't want to be a suburb of Nashville. There seemed to be a bigger kind of sense of community in Lebanon versus Mount Juliet. So I feel like maybe that gets at Kendra's answer of, you know, as the growth in the region as a whole happens, we may start feeling more suburban. And how do you get that kind of, not just conservation and policy driven, but that sense of place in each community is really important to maintain. Dory, you have your hand raised for another question.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to jump on what Paul was saying and Joe, because it is a very important point. I don't know legally how some of this might work, but, you know, as Joe was saying, a lot of times in Williamson County for a while, we could sort of rely on, well, there's no sewer. So that sort of is an underpinning. It sort of helps to keep things lower density. And then you don't have to do a lot of the other zoning, if you will. But if a community through zoning or through land use planning decides we want this area to have, we don't need a lot of those services. I don't know what the legalities are for that, but we've, as an organization, worked a tremendous amount with TDEC and Williamson County and others across the state on those alternative sewer systems, because they've essentially enabled a lot of leapfrog development. And so that we were talking earlier about asking the question, how do some of the state policies affect local? We were wrestling with in the legislature a bill by that one company so that one part of their whole sewer system wasn't even going to be reviewed by the state. So there are counties like Williamson County and some others who've had to add some of their own requirements, if you will. It's been a tremendous challenge. So I have a question back to some of y'all who are in the world of planning and law, which is, are you legally justified to say in your land use plans, these are areas where we intend not to provide certain services or services of only certain levels?
Well, I mean, I think in Nashville, we have rural policy areas, and we have some areas without sewer, and Nashville Next discourages sewer extension into certain areas. But at the end of the day, it's a decision that if the council wants to rezone a property and extend sewer, then, I mean, that can be done against our recommendation. So that's an issue that I mean, there's one part of the city where I think it didn't have sewer and the septic systems were failing, and I think there became a time where Metro had to extend the sewer because it was becoming a health problem. So there's issues like that maybe are beyond the control of land use policy. If the septic systems are old or not working and failing, then, and people are living there, then the city has to consider extending those, whether the policy supports it or not.
Yeah, and if I can just kind of jump on a little bit. So in regards to the annexation, you know, we kind of get into this issue a lot of what is the purpose of unincorporated land versus incorporated land, especially in these smaller communities. So there is within the annexation resolutions that we will put forward, there is a line that says within the plan of services, it'll say if sewer or water is not existing, it will be provided funds permitting. And so, you know, it's a little bit vague intentionally so that it's not a definite commitment necessarily, but in areas where sewer is difficult or due to existing line sizes and things like that, it's really not, it's not going to be feasible to extend utilities in that area. Then it really becomes a question of, should this be land that is annexed, which, you know, with the fairly new annexation law, property owners have to request annexation, but it doesn't say that the cities have to accept that annexation. So, you know, that really becomes, is this a viable place to promote utilities and growth in this area? So that really, in the smaller communities that have not, you know, developed throughout their entire growth areas, that becomes sort of how we control where sewer and water utilities are feasible to be extended.
Well, we've got a couple more minutes in our meeting time. I've thoroughly enjoyed this discussion. I think all of our panelists made it clear there's no one solution and that land use is just a piece of it. When you start talking about public works and maintenance, infrastructure, utility districts, there's so many more entities. Don't get me started on school districts. So if anybody has any final questions or comments, we've got 2 more minutes. Of course, I'll be sending out minutes, our meeting recording. So we have the panelists' emails if you really want to ask them about something you heard. And if no more questions, our next meeting will be in August, our quarterly meeting. And I know I speak for all of us that I really appreciate all of our panelists' time. This was a really, really interesting discussion. All right. If there's no more questions, you can always follow up through me or directly to our panelists. And I'll give you guys that follow-up email in the next couple of days. So thank you again, everyone. I hope you have a great day.
You too. Thank you.
Thanks for
Thank
having
you,
us.
Carson.
Absolutely. Thank you for having us.